like to introduce our guests through how I got to know them because I'm privileged to know a bunch of really interesting people and really smart people. And Tad is, as you're about to learn, wicked smart. And we met at the inaugural meeting of the Institute for New Economic Thinking up in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And I remember almost like it was yesterday, that had to be 2010 or so, sitting on rocking chairs on the porch. And I was hanging around with a whole bunch of really smart people going, holy smokes. And honestly, one of the recollections was that there were these, I remember Bill Reese was there and I can't remember who else, but there was all these people who, were in the world of, academics and applied academics. And the world I came out of, not that much long before that, the world of Wall Street and banking, they all thought they were so smart, but they really had no idea what was actually going on in the world. And Tad is someone who's been way ahead of his time in thinking through the complexity and interconnections and interrelationships between what these crises that we now bunch together and call the polycrisis. So we're going to dive into that in a moment. But anyway, Tad, great to have you with us.
It's just wonderful to be with you again, John.
Yeah, it's been a while. We decided to do blue today, so
We look the same. This is not intentional, everyone.
yeah, we both have the same amount of gray hair.
Yeah.
We're working on the same beat. So one thing I learned about you, Tad, that I didn't know before you became an MIT PhD and superstar in complexity science, you used to work on an oil rig. And so here's the guy who is telling us about climate change and peak oil and systems catastrophes, actually started out life working on an oil rig. So I'm just curious what you learned in that job that's more important than what you learned since that job.
Oh, wow. So that's a very interesting way to start the conversation. Uh, so
Thought I'd
when I
surprise you.
no, and it's great and very relevant in many ways. So when I was a teenager, I was actually not interested in any of this stuff. I was really interested in cars. I was really interested in restoring. My first one was an old Oldsmobile Rocket 88 from 1952, and I rebuilt the thing from the ground up. And I say this in one of my books. It was my first introduction to the nature of a mechanistic worldview, a mechanistic paradigm. I can remember looking at that block with oil pouring out of it in my dad's garage, and he was, of course, completely appalled. I'd taken the heads off and stuff like that, and I suddenly understood how everything worked together with the timing chain and the valves and the heads and everything. And yeah, so that's what I was doing. And I went to work on the rigs because I wanted to raise money to buy a much fancier
My
car.
car.
Yeah, a very high-powered car, which I eventually did. But I did work on the rigs, as it turned out, in BC and Alberta for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years, as a roughneck on the floor of rigs as a motorman. I eventually ran motors. And I worked on pipeline crews and turnaround crews for refineries in the summer and stuff, mostly in the summer while I was putting myself through the first years of university. And I learned a whole bunch of things. It was roughly the equivalent, say, to my father's generation of going off to war, right? It was very, very tough, and the circumstances extremely dangerous sometimes. Lots of responsibility, lots of different personalities. But one thing I learned, which has carried through to the present, is I just got a deep fascination with drilling. I'm really interested in the heavy industrial project of drilling. And one of the projects within the
Yeah, we're
Cascade,
going to come back to that.
probably noticed,
Don't share that. I want to end with
okay. But it's
on a high note.
yeah. So that interest in drilling and
Yeah,
in has continued all the way through to the present in my life and present
cool.
and we now
Yeah.
exploited that interest. Let's put it that way. I'll leave that
Yeah,
aside.
we'll come back to that. We didn't talk about that earlier, but I do know about that, and I do
Yeah.
want to ask you about that at the end. Um, So let's jump into complexity science for a second. And again, we're not going to talk a lot about complexity science, but one of the things that I think resonated with me so strongly when I first met you, and then when I came up and spent some time with you, is that, there's sort of complexity science is now kind of in vogue, and there's multiple different types of complexity science. And as a non-complexity scientist, I sort of boil it down to a mechanistic approach where people are trying to develop models using agent-based modeling to better explain what's happening, even though what's happening is not what we want to happen. And then the alternative approach, which is where my work is a living system science complexity, which is much more prescriptive. It's looking at how life works and saying what are the patterns and principles of that, and how do we apply that, in my case, to the economic system and the financial system. And I think it's fair to say, in your case, to systems of governance and policy making, but through a political science lens rather than, although they're obviously very connected, but more through a political and policy governance perspective. But is that a fair representation of your use of complexity science?
Yes, I think so. I think the distinction you make is really fundamental between a non-adaptive mechanistic view of complexity and a view of complexity that is more ecological and adaptive. And they're complexity science, for instance, the complexity science of the Santa Fe Institute originally emerged from mathematics, from physics, from information science, with
Yeah.
enormous advances that were very important, going back to Bertalanffy and original systems theory, in the 1950s, and and that was an important foundation. But more recently, especially with the work of folks like the ecologist Buzz Halling, complexity science developed another, in a sense, another foundation, which was an ecological foundation, which was much more grounded in evolutionary theory, theories of networks, and much more receptive to systems that are deeply connective and where all the elements are co-evolving simultaneously.
Mhm.
One of the implications, and you were sort of alluding to this, I think, is that this alternative origin of complexity science, this more ecological origin, uh, really ratchets up the need to be comfortable with uncertainty and with mess and with
Mhm.
unpredictability of the future.
Mhm.
Now, complexity science has always had a high tolerance for that, even on the mechanistic side, because one of the principles on the mechanistic side is that there's high sensitivity to initial conditions. It's basically chaos theory. A small change can make a huge difference, even in a mechanistic complex system like the climate, right? But when you get into ecology, you've got orders of magnitude more sources of diversity, of variance in the system, of uncertainty, and constant creation of novelty, right?
Mhm.
Constant
Mhm.
emergence of novelty. And
And in fact, that's what you want to get
yeah,
out of a bind. Yeah.
I find most people find this really scary. One of the things that I think it discourages people from doing complex systems theory is because most people don't like mess. They don't like disorder. They want certainty. Tell us what to do, fix this. Of course,
Yeah.
that's the source of, in many respects, the support for the populist authoritarians around the world.
Mm.
Um, so that's a burden that
That
all
that
complexity
was a
science.
little segue to a future topic here.
Yeah, that's the discomfort with mass and the discomfort with uncertainty is a source of it's a burden that all complexity science has to carry, and it's one of the
Yeah.
things that dissuades people from being attracted to it. But when you get into the ecological perspectives, it's just it's even scarier. But just to go to the point you were just making, I actually find it emancipatory. I find it
Yeah.
exciting because it offers the possibility for novelty. There's constant
Yeah.
creation of novelty, and it's in that novelty where we may actually be able to rescue ourselves as a
Right.
species.
And that, the folks that have taken courses with me will recognize that novelty as what what I call regenerative potential, which
Definitely.
is unknowable in advance and therefore not in the models, not in the analysis. But if we create the right conditions, possibilities exist.
Right. So that notion of unknowability in advance is profoundly important. And there are very, very few people, John, who come to that point, I think, in in their understanding complexity theory.
Hmm.
Um, and it's
Because they're all trying to model it. The first thing they want to do is model it, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, we'll get to this. Modeling can serve its purposes and can be enormously valuable because it can
Yeah,
scope out, give you some sense for the direction you have to point yourself in.
yeah,
But really, what we should be looking for is the development of those early, and I think this is what you're doing in much of your work, the development of those early opportunities for breakthrough that otherwise we wouldn't see if we weren't aware of them,
right, right.
if we weren't aware of the possibility of that novelty.
So let's jump into what thanks to the World Economic Forum, we're now all calling the polycrisis.
Mhm.
And in researching this morning, I discovered you didn't invent that term, although you've invented several terms, but you're certainly one of the leading scholars on sort of seriously what does a polycrisis mean, how it is to be understood and grasped. So give us a quick summary of your work on the polycrisis, if you can, Ted.
So we need to use you in the plural because it's really a team here at the Cascade Institute and a remarkable group of people. Some of whom I've been working with uh, for 15 years or more. One in particular, Mike Lawrence, whose name will appear on a lot of these
Yeah.
things, was an undergraduate student with me at the University of Toronto back in the early
Hmm.
2000s. So
Was he there when I came to visit you? I don't
I
remember
think
that.
he may have been. Yes, I expect he
Really?
probably was. If he came to our house and we
Yeah.
had our little conferences and stuff, he would have been there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mike is remarkable. He's one of the best theoretical minds I've ever encountered.
Then I know who he is now because there was a guy there that was blowing my mind. So,
Yeah, yeah. And but now we have others who I have to, mention. Megan Shipman, who's a neuroscientist. I'll talk more about her and her work in particular in a moment. Um, and a group of other people. So we're expanding the polycrisis group. And just for your viewers today, if you want to know more about the work that's happening in this domain, not just our work, but of groups and people around the world, we have set up a website called polycrisis.org, which now I think if you Google polycrisis, it pretty well always comes out right at the top or very
yeah.
close to the top of the list. And that provides basically, it's a resource. It provides links to all the most recent important stuff being done on polycrisis thinking around the world. And also answer some basic questions. So, to get to your question, the way the World Economic Forum and a lot of people are using the polycrisis is that, it's just a lot of bad shit happening all simultaneously, right? Okay, that's fine. But then what's the difference between this concept and say that notion that we used to use of a perfect storm? Just a lot of bad things happening simultaneously. Well, a perfect storm is even in the original story, it was kind of a coincidence of events, right? And we're arguing, and I think we've established a pretty good empirical foundation for this argument that this isn't a coincidence, that the fact that a lot of things are going wrong simultaneously, geopolitical, ecological, economic, um, political, and sociological, that there are relationships between these
Mhm.
phenomena and they are reinforcing each other. And they're
Mhm.
feedback loops. So to get to complexity theory, a lot of it's about feedback loops, identifying where the feedback loops are, both reinforcing ones and self-equilibrating feedback loops.
Mhm.
And so what we've been trying to do in our work is develop a basic apparatus for pulling apart the different connections and understanding where those feedback loops are.
Mhm.
Um, so a lot of bad stuff happening simultaneously is because what's happening with the world is we're flipping into a new equilibrium. Another core concept of complexity science is this idea that you have multiple stability zones for a system, and we are moving from one stability zone to another stability zone. And that's because of these connections between the stresses and crises we're facing in the world. So that's our
Isn't it
perspective
fair to
on all.
say, Tad, that that's a proof of the, interconnectedness of everything, down to the level of physics, the entanglement of everything. So when we break these crises into their own thing, we're back in a Newtonian world of parts as opposed to a holistic world.
Yeah. So, again, in our complexity language, we're dealing with an emergent phenomenon. We're dealing with something where the bits and pieces don't explain the whole. You have to actually put all the bits and pieces together, and then you start to see things that only properties that only are visible at the whole. And the polycrisis is a property that's only visible at the level of the species in the globe, right? Fully visible. And human beings relentlessly try, in part because of our cognitive bandwidth issues, we try to divide things up into silos, focus on a little problem here, and a subset of problems here. But we can't do that anymore because the emergent phenomena of the whole are driving us over a cliff. And so we need a new way of thinking, the kind of approach and paradigm that you've adopted, the kind we're trying to pioneer at the Cascade Institute. And the key thing here, and that one of the critical debates within this polycrisis conversation between the skeptics, people like Neil Ferguson at the Hoover Institute, he's a good example. Maybe Steven Pinker would be another. There's nothing, actually, Steven Pinker is probably not a good example, but Neil Ferguson is definitely a good example, that there's nothing new happening in the world, that this is just, we've always had crises, humankind has always had crises, and this is just history happening. That's exactly the term that Ferguson used at the World Economic Forum in, I think, 2023. This is just history happening. My arguments, and I've made this most pointedly in a response to Ferguson in Vox, is that this is actually a sui generis situation for humankind. This is brand new. We've never been in this situation before. And so we need radically different tools to understand it.
Did you persuade him?
Well, he never answered. However,
But
that Vox
it's
article,
symptomatic of the bias. People are still rejecting the very, and this is, I'm sure, the basis of our initial conversations, going back 50 years, the limits, that there are limits to growth, that there are planetary boundaries that will mean that our economy can't grow exponentially forever. That's not even yet accepted in
yeah. So
the mainstream.
that argument is what broadly dismissed as neo-Malthusian.
Yeah.
So I have a somewhat different take on neo-Malthusianism. I've been labeled a neo-Malthusian for decades. I think one of the problems, it's a straw man attack, of course, one of the responses I have is, you can call me that if you want, I don't care, but I, just like you in your work, acutely aware of the creativity of human beings in response to challenges, because we are complex adaptive systems.
Right.
So what the whole idea of there being hard limits, like ceilings, is a bit misleading, because depending on our creativity, those ceilings are plastic, right? But they don't go away. We have to push them back. We have to be smarter and smarter, and there is probably ultimately a limit to our problem solving ability, that at some point we create problems for ourselves that are too hard for us to solve. And that's the argument I developed in my book, now over 20 years old, The Ingenuity Gap. So the limits we face are really in here. And I think what we're finding with people's difficulty in accepting complexity is that we're running into the limits in here, right? Because we need to shift to this complex systems thinking in order to save ourselves. And a lot of people are saying, no, it's I can't tell you how often I get this.
I have a different theory on why that's happening. I'm curious if you would disagree with this. I imagine you've read The Master and His Emissary.
I have not, actually.
Oh my goodness. that's hard to imagine that I've read a book you haven't read.
Oh, I'm
But
sure there are lots of them, John. I should be talking about your best book list.
you're yeah, we should have that follow-up conversation. By the way, Tom, oh, there you go. One of us froze, but you're back, so that's good.
Yeah, yeah.
So Ian McGilchrist develops this thesis. He's a brain scientist, psychologist, serious scholar of the mind and the brain. And he develops the left brain, right brain analysis to oversimplify it. And essentially, the title of the book says we're allowing the emissary, meaning our left brain analytical, competitive, rational brain, to dominate when our right brain, which is where we can see whole and see complexity and our imagination lies, to your point about limitations of our thinking, we've actually not only allowed to atrophy, we've intentionally atrophied it by celebrating the left brain attributes. And the punchline is, if we don't rebalance and reintegrate our left brain into our right brain, but the right brain being the master, we're doomed. And so I would argue that our resistance to complexity science and our resistance to things that make us messy, that are messy and uncomfortable, is we've designed modernity to celebrate the left brain at the expense of the right brain.
And it's served us very well in some very fundamental
Exactly.
ways. The
Yeah.
reductionism has allowed us to generate this extraordinary wealth, these machines that we're using right
Right.
now.
Right.
It's hard for people to give that up, right?
Yeah.
But we need to move
Yeah.
to a different headspace, to use the
Yeah.
vernacular. Um,
And it's
within
not an either or. It's an integration. It's not that the left brain's bad. It's that, we need
Exactly.
both. So, but I know you've done some work in the polycrisis. You were sharing me just when we started, that you've actually developed a model with this group of researchers. So share with us what that's
Yes.
about.
So this is kind of hot off the presses. This is a model of the global system broken down. Now, with all the caveats that you and I have just been discussing about modeling, about reductionism, et cetera, all of those, in a sense, as context. But we identified 11 macro global systems: climate, economy, health, transportation, technology, energy, et cetera. And then we identified within each of those systems, and this is over a period of a couple of years, a set of possible states. So for instance, for climate, we specified 3 possible states in 2100: under 2.5 degrees warming, 2.5 to 4, and over 4 degrees warming. And then for each of the states, each of the other systems, like the economy, transportation, et cetera, we have a series of states, possible states going out, in this case, in our first run of the model, to 2040. And we have between 3 and 5 states for each one of the systems. So across the 11 systems, we have 45 states. And we're using an approach to modeling called cross-impact balance assessment, which was developed by a German, eminent German mathematician by the name of Wolfgang Weimer-Yale. He's at Stuttgart. And but it hasn't received a lot of traction. It's an extraordinarily powerful method, in part because it allows you to enter fuzzy data into the model. So unlike system dynamics or general equilibrium models that would be used, for instance, in limits to growth or by economists, you can put into cross-impact balance models information from experts who have been, say, familiar with a particular set of systems or subsystems for decades. And they have this, to go to your earlier point about different ways of thinking, they have a deeply intuitive way, not reductionist, but deeply intuitive pattern recognition, neural net way of understanding the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say to them, well, if something happens over here in this part of the system, what do you think will happen? And they'll say, well, I think there's a high probability that this will happen over here, right? But they see only one part of the world. And what we can do with cross-impact balance models is we can take the knowledge from that expert, plug it into a part of our model, but plug in information from other experts in different parts. And what you end up with is an enormous matrix. some of your viewers might be familiar with Vasily Leontief's input-output matrices. He won the Nobel Prize back, I think, in '73. So it's a bit like that, where you have all of the systems, which are called descriptors, on one axis and another, and the same ones on another axis. And so you're relating every single state of every single system to every single state of every other system. It's a big matrix. 1,800 judgments. I got the team together for a week to do this, and we spent almost 2 years doing the empirical research to figure out how to states for each of the systems. So to cut to the chase, we made all the judgments. They're all empirically grounded. They're all going to be justified, and there's a particular way of making the judgments in the matrix for each state related to every other state. The total number of possible scenarios for 2040 is 4,050,000. So you need a computer to do this, right? And the software crunches through essentially which of those states, those scenarios are stable and which ones are unstable. And it migrates all of the unstable ones to stable states, basically to basins of attraction or to equilibrium. So here's the punchline. There are 10 that are stable, and one of them is good. And of the 10 that are stable, 11. In the latest run, it was 11, and one of them is good. And that's the 11 that are stable. The 10 that aren't good are really not good. So there are the state of the world today, but either worse or significantly worse. And together they make an enormous attractor, sucking up almost 3.5 million of those different scenarios. The good one.
Do they attract to each other?
Basically, it's like a big basin, and all the other scenarios that are not quite as stable are getting sucked into that basin. It's like a big black hole, right? The good one, which we're calling the hope attractor, is much smaller, but it's very good. And if you can get there, it's very stable. In other words, it's strong. And it's characterized by strong democracy, significant science, agricultural, economic, and AI science, strong governance, in other words, competent institutions, significant social solidarity, right? But the key thing is that
sounds like just what we have.
you can't see this possibility by looking at all the little numbers in the matrix. It is emergent. It emerges as a possible future for us. So then the question is, given where we are in this massive 11-dimensional state space, and we're sliding towards the really big bad attractor, is there a way of getting ourselves through this landscape to the good one? And that's the question we're exploring right now. So we think this is actually a major finding, and we're planning to start.
Where can we find? Is that on the polycrisis website?
Not yet, but it will be. Next week, I'm starting to write it up for Nature. I think it's for Nature.
Hot off the press. Not even on the press.
And we will. One of the really impressive things about this method is two of them. It's legible and it's corrigible. Unlike system dynamics or any of these other models, you don't have to have highly specialized mathematical knowledge. So people will be able to see the matrix. They'll understand how it works and how the math works. It's relatively simple. And they can go in, we'll load the whole thing in an open source platform, and they can go in and they can change the numbers themselves. If they say, oh, we don't like your judgments about the relationships between, say, climate change and the food system, we're going to put in different judgments, and they can do their own sensitivity testing.
Cool.
So we think this is going to be enormously valuable for firms, for communities, for policymakers.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts, Todd, that I like I would love to steer it toward regenerative economics and see if it increases the basin, the good basin.
Yes. So I have to ask you, John, in your work on regenerative economics, have you been thinking about bioregionalism at all?
Of course. First principle.
Yeah. So
One of the first principles.
So we will be knocking on your door to ask about your thinking about the economic organization of bioregions, because I think that an important part of this hope attractor in terms of economic and social and political organization is going to be bioregionalism.
Yeah.
So uh, now this is tough because we're creating a world that's going to be radically different by 2100, even just in terms of its temperature and energy balance on the planet, right? So
Yeah.
so bioregionalism is
Yeah, I
going to
noticed you didn't run the 1.5 degree scenario. I picked up on
uh,
that.
no. Although I think
Good.
this Hope attractor, this basin of attraction, this possible world, it's clear looking at the science that's in it, that commitment to science, that they are heading over the hump in terms of carbon emissions. In other words, they're
Mm.
even though we've only modeled to 2040, I think when we go out to 2055, we'll
Yeah.
see that the temperatures are now starting to ramp down. Um,
So I could talk for hours about this, and I got another topic or two I want to get to, but just one question on this. Tie in go back to Hollings and adaptive cycle. Um, these are not just, 10 bad and one good. The way to get to the one good is by unwinding the current.
yes.
So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, um, just very quickly for the adaptive cycle, for those folks who may not be familiar with it online, this is a model that was originally developed by the ecologist. And notice John and I are both talking about our roots essentially in complexity theory in ecology by the ecologist Buzz Holling, who is a Canadian ecologist, but globally renowned. If there were a Nobel Prize in ecology, he would have won it. He's passed away now. He founded the Resilience Alliance, the global network of thinkers who use this adaptive cycle as a kind of conceptual apparatus. And basically, the adaptive cycle is an idea that all systems that are involve complex adaptation. So this basically means living systems go through a process of over time increasing complexity and rigidity, increasing potential for creativity, but loss of actual creativity because the increasing rigidity, and then eventually they become so sclerotic and rigid that they have crisis and they break down. And in that breakdown process, the links between a lot of the components of the systems are broken, and you can get reorganization of the components in
Right,
ways that are highly productive and innovative.
right.
So it maps quite closely, interestingly, even though Buzz was very progressive intellectually, onto Austrian school, Hayek, Schumpeter, and others, the idea of creative destruction, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, so have I got that right,
Yeah,
John?
yeah,
More?
that's great. That's great. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. I'm going to switch to, I mean, we could
Yeah, well,
spend the rest
let
of
me
the time on this.
just say quickly in answer to
Okay,
your question. I'll keep this very brief. The
okay,
the 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 key idea here is that you actually need this kind of crisis in order to produce
right,
innovation, right?
exactly.
And this is a concept I did introduce in neologism in the Upside Down. This is a process I call catagenesis. So rebirth through breakdown, and clearly that's what's happening in the world right now. We are getting a breakdown process. We're shifting to a new equilibrium.
Yeah,
Linkages are being broken apart. We see it with the
right.
higher education system in the United States, for instance. It's not inevitable that only bad things will emerge from this process because we're
Yeah,
creating possibilities for novelty and innovation that weren't there before. So
exactly.
that would be
Which is
catagenic.
a reason to remain hopeful in my mind.
Exactly.
But it
Exactly.
isn't, but that's not to say that that's automatic. Systems do
No, I
collapse.
mean the probability is clearly on the side of disaster, but
Yeah.
but you know,
Even if you just go 1 in 11, that's not good.
yeah, I mean, there's the hope attractor, right? You can
Yeah,
see it
yeah,
in our models, and so that gives
yeah,
us something to go for. And especially
yeah,
once you know what it looks like, it gives you more power to be able to find out how to get there.
yeah. And I gotta believe that, a intelligent use of AI and an AI that's trained on holistic thinking, not reductionist thinking, can enhance our chances. So this is a super exciting opening to a much longer conversation.
Yes.
We've actually got a guy who a course alum who's switched his AI business plan to be a holistic regenerative AI agent rather than a reductionist AI agent, which is what most of the AIs out there are going to do. So
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
And the interesting thing is, modern AI is quintessentially emergent. It's pattern
exactly.
recognition. These are
Yeah,
neural nets. They should actually be really good at the
yeah.
holistic approach, right?
Is that right? even if they're trained
They
on
should be.
reductionist knowledge?
Well, yeah, because they're being trained on reductionist knowledge, but the underlying architecture of the AI
Hmm.
involves neural nets. You can't with modern AI, with any kind of neural net, you cannot pinpoint the location of a particular piece of knowledge anywhere in the system. It's distributed across the entire network, right? Just like in our brains.
Interesting.
So it's quintessentially non-reductionist. So we should,
Wow.
we should be getting the AI to do what it's
Wow.
constructed.
That's very
You know,
hopeful.
it's
So the
something
AI has
aligned with
come
its
along just when we need it.
yeah, and so for instance, I think
There you
that
go.
the modern AI is we're training it on we're training it on reductionist data, but it is essentially about pattern recognition and emergent phenomena.
Hmm.
That's what it does. You know,
Yeah.
that's what human
Fascinating.
brains are incredibly good at. That's why we want to get that fuzzy knowledge from experts
Yeah.
and load because they've been trained their neural nets for
Yeah.
decades on,
Cool.
the politics of the Middle East or something. Okay, so let's plug it into our cross impact balance matrix.
I'm already feeling more hopeful about AI. Thank you.
I should tell you
Um,
that our Hope Attractor, 30 seconds, 15. Our Hope Attractor, one of the states is managed AI. If you have unmanaged AI, then things
yeah.
blow. Okay.
I don't need a computer to tell me that.
That's right.
All right. Those of you who are listening carefully will notice that Tad's got a Canadian accent. And Tad has been extremely, as always, ahead of the curve in anticipating this moment. Written op-eds about coming politics in the United States and is deeply involved in trying to help Canada manage the current crisis. And again, Tad, this is totally unfair, but can you just give us a snippet of how you're thinking about Canada? And I might just prompt it by saying that, I read your piece earlier, and we'll get a link to it and get it in the chat if you remind us how to find it. But the analysis of the problems of Canada, you could substitute the United States. They're exactly the same. And yet we have this very different polarity of superpower and relatively small country, in terms of economy and not in terms of resources, but certainly in scale of economy. And we're now in somewhat of I don't know if I call it an economic war, but it's economic
Oh,
violence.
it's war. It's
Yeah,
war. That's the
yeah.
way we're conceiving
So
of it here.
talk briefly about it, and then we're going to move on to a hopeful topic before we
Yes.
bring everyone else in. So
Yeah. So it's a terrible situation, John, and I think as most of your viewers realize, President Trump was back at his 51st state stuff yesterday. Basically, he is trying to coerce Canada into buying into the Golden Dome ballistic missile defense program, which for those of you, I studied this at MIT years ago. For those of you who know something about the possibility of actually protecting the United States or North America from a major ballistic missile attack, nuclear attack, it's essentially impossible. So this is a fantasy. And but he's saying, you either do it or we make you the 51st state. You either buy in at $61 billion, which in Canadian dollars would be 100 billion, or we make you the 51st state. I can't over stress how dramatic the reaction has been in Canada. In fact, we've had a complete system flip in the last 4 months. And a party that would look like it was down and out has been reelected with a new prime minister, a new leader, who I think, frankly, is probably the most competent leader in the world right now.
absolutely,
He's quite
and the right
extraordinary
right
person.
man for the time,
Yeah,
kind of
right
thing.
man for the moment. He is quite
Yeah.
extraordinary. Mark Carney's perception is that we are at war, and that this is an existential crisis for the country. He's trying to bring Canadians along to that. I think there's actually a deeper and broader recognition of the nature of the crisis in Canada than is widely recognized. And, uh, and I think there's an opportunity in Canada to come back to some of the hopeful stuff we were talking about and catagenesis stuff. often in these big complex systems, sources of the genesis of innovation is often in on the periphery of the hegemon, on the periphery of the power system, right?
Mhm.
And Canada has now become, for better or for worse, and we certainly didn't ask for this, we have become a critical front line for the defense of liberal democracy in the world.
Mhm.
And the document you were referring to is a document that's online, which is titled at the Cascade Institute, Defending Canada's Democracy. It includes inside it a causal analysis of what has weakened Canadian democracy. It's got 4 causal processes, which, as you say, is generalizable. It was actually developed to be generalizable across all Western societies. So it applies to the United States with a couple of additional bells and whistles, if I were to speak specifically about the US situation.
Mm.
It's a fundamentally systemic approach. And we're building a program on democracy around, the Cascade Institute is building a program around that strategic framework on defending democracy, principally defending Canadian democracy. But if democracy in Canada falls, it's going to make it way harder for Europe, something I'm trying to convince my European friends. And to the extent that we can represent in Canada some of the continuing principles of a liberal society, that I think strengthens the proponents of those possibilities in the United States too. So we're really important to this battle at this point.
Mm.
And the country is it's going through a series of, it's like the 7 stages of grief or something like that. It's like, we
But
can't believe this.
yeah. Do you have a
And oh
better
my God,
understanding? Do you have a better
that's
understanding than we do as to why this happened? Like of all
Oh,
things,
I have a piece. If folks want to look at it, there's a piece on the website. It's also on my website, homerdixon.com, which is titled "Si vis pacem parabellum," which is a Latin phrase for "if you want peace, prepare for war."
yeah.
It's basically an argument that Canada needs to stand up civil defense and homeland defense in order to protect our sovereign boundaries, because Trump is arguing that President Trump, excuse me, have to be polite, Mr. Trump, arguing that the boundaries are no longer legally legitimate. um, and uh, uh, you know, one of the points I make in that piece is that Donald Trump has a vision of the world as a risk game, right?
Right.
It's like a risk map.
Yeah.
And if you looked at, for instance, for quite a while beside his desk in the Oval Office was a map of the Gulf of America. And it looked like a cartoon map. It looked like a risk map, right?
Mm.
And he keeps talking about North America. Wouldn't it be so beautiful? It would be just such a,
Yeah.
to have the whole thing united, right? So
Mm.
he sees the world as fundamentally a conflict between China, Russia, and the United States. And in
Mm.
that conflict, he needs to have he sees the resource hinterland of the United States as including Canada and Greenland and Panama.
Mm.
I mean, there's that logic in the background. That's
Mm.
where it comes from,
Mm.
and
Mm.
he hasn't recognized that Canada is actually quite a distinct society. We
Mm.
over a period of a couple centuries, there's been this massive migration of people with different value systems. There are lots of Canadians who could have lived in the States. So I had a job offer at Columbia University, and I love the United States. I do, and I studied there, and it's amazing. But I wanted to be in Canada.
Yeah.
A lot of folks have made the same decision,
Mm.
and we're prepared to fight to defend that.
Yeah, you were saying there's a poll that you wanted to share, the polling
Yeah,
data.
so there was a debate in the early days of the 51st state stuff and annexation talk. There was a debate in the Cascade Institute and also with some other folks, but it was a debate across the country about how prepared Canadians were actually to stand up and fight for their country. And there was, people were saying, well, Canadians are soft, we're so nice and stuff. So I said, I don't think so, but let's go out. It's an empirical question. So we hired one of the best polling firms in
Mm.
Canada, who happens to be also one of the best polling firms in the world when it comes to values surveys. And we went out and we did a very rigorous online survey of 2,000, no more than 2,000 Canadians, all quota sampled to balance with census information in Canada, regionally, socio-demographically, everything. And the figures are amazing. 75% of Canadians would if Canada were attacked, 75% of Canadians would do something in defense of the country.
Mm.
About a third would join civil defense. 15% would be prepared to join a violent resistance in the case of occupation. That's 6 million people. If you just deduct the people who are just speaking bravado, and you cut in half again for the people who may not be physically able, you're still left with a potential insurgency of 1.5 million people. The Taliban insurgency was 100,000. An insurgency, if the United States were ultimately, who did try to occupy Canada, it would bleed the United States white. Right. And another very important thing is that 38% of Canadians are prepared to die, depending on the circumstances, for the country. These are figures that in Canada, at least, are really surprising. I don't know what the equivalent figures in the United States would be, but they show that there is a profound sense of, first of all, anger, but also loyalty to the polity and to the society. Now, it's different across in different Alberta and Quebec and stuff like that. But interestingly enough, the bellicosity of the population is higher in Alberta than it is in other parts of the country. And I think it's partly because they are very individualistic and they don't want to be told what to do, right? Yeah. So I don't think there's going to be a war between Canada and the United States. I think it's incredibly improbable. But what this does do is it provides the federal government with the potential legitimacy and sense of political support for standing up significant civil defense in the country.
Well, and it also, that's now energy into this interconnected system that will affect the outcome. It's not a simple cause and effect. Will there be war? Won't there be war? The world has shifted because of this.
Yeah. In my CB's Packham article, I pointed out that it actually wouldn't start with tanks massing on the border. Right. What it would start with is Trump saying, "Well, we want to adjust the border in the Great Lakes."
Right.
Well, and we want to take these oil fields
just beyond the edge of the water, just beyond the edge of the lake.
Yeah. So I have heard, because quite quickly after the piece came out, I got a message from the Prime Minister's office that this view is shared at the highest levels of the country. So we have prepared a proposal on national civil defense and submitted it to the Prime Minister's office.
Well, good for you.
Yeah, all right. So I don't think Americans realize what's happening up here. We're just, remember, hockey is a very violent game, and we're really.
Yeah. Well, it's clear that there are the amount. I just read about it, but there's a hotel I know in near Portland, Maine, that is usually filled with Canadians, and they may go out of business. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, it's terrible. I mean, it's very sad. Across the water here in Port Angeles, they are really hurting. I mean, it's terrible. It is, and I know just about everybody on this call today feels deeply appalled by what's happening. And Canadians recognize that almost 50% of Americans didn't vote for this guy. Yeah. We remember that,
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's actually only 65% of us voted, so it's even less than that.
It's even less, exactly.
Yeah. Let's switch to ending on a note of hope. And your last book was called Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. Was that was after the polycrisis or after the pandemic or before?
It was actually published in the middle of the pandemic, to my great regret.
Nice timing.
Really hard to publish a book in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah. But I also want to take you back to the oil rig, and I knew this is where you were going earlier. But you wrote a piece, I'm sure it's years ago now, that I read. I don't think I told you at the time, but it was my education about ultra deep geothermal, and it struck me as incredibly hopeful and amazing. And I'm not current on it, so can you share with us two things? One, just the thesis of your book on hope and why hope is so important, and contrast it with optimism, naive optimism. And then secondly, just, give us a technological upper on possibilities that we don't currently have in our view shed.
And that's a great way to finish up before we go to a conversation. So in Commanding Hope, I'm quite critical of conventional notions of hope, and I guess what you could call folk understanding of hope, which tends to lead us to wishful thinking and denialism and many passivity.
Mm.
And instead, I argue for a much more muscular understanding of hope, which has a number of characteristics. uh, it's honest, astute, and powerful. So by honest, I mean that it's very much grounded in a full recognition of the
Yeah.
gravity of the problems we
Yeah.
face. And that makes hope much harder, right? And there's a tension between honesty and hope in our current world. But we need to start with an understanding. And that's why we're doing things like the polycrisis core model that I talked about earlier. So honest hope, uh, it needs to be powerful in the sense that it needs to have a vision of the future and where we want to go. And this is where things like bioregionalism come in, that hope attractor, having a sense for what the possibilities are so we can direct ourselves to it. And it needs to be astute in the sense that it needs to have a very accurate strategic understanding of the political and social landscape so that you know where your allies are and your opponents are and who the potential the people who can be reached or the groups that can be reached and the ones that can't, so that you can navigate your way across the landscape to try to get to that future. So this is a very practical, pragmatic, muscular notion of hope. And I wrote the book, as you know, for my children who are now
Yeah.
17 and 20. They were 4 and 7 when I started, and I knew they were going to be emerging into this world and looking around and saying, "Is this what we get?" Like all young people nowadays, you've got to be kidding me. This is my future, and I said this was my attempt to give them something. I said, okay, so this is the kind of mental apparatus you need to survive and thrive. Okay, so that's the hope notion, but it needs to be practical. And what does this mean in practical terms? And if you look at the climate problem, practically, it's an energy problem. It's about our energy system. And the energy problem becomes an electricity problem because we need to generate enormous amounts of carbon-free electricity. And going back to my drilling, I've always been interested in drilling. And since my days at MIT, I've always wondered, why aren't we just tapping the heat of the biggest reactor on the planet, right? Rather than, building a whole bunch of little reactors all over the surface of the planet with all their attendant problems of proliferation of fissile material and,
Mm.
you know, pollution and stuff, waste disposal. Let's go into the planet and tap the heat of the best shielded, biggest reactor on the planet, which is the core of the planet.
Mm.
Use Gaia, in a sense, Mother Earth, to keep us warm and safe and prosperous. So when we started the Cascade Institute, we quickly identified this as a possibility, in part because Canada is really good at drilling holes in the ground, and we could be world leaders in this thing. And so we've put together a remarkable, just an incredible team of people, geophysicists, geologists, energy modelers, and the like. And we are trying to drive Canada to that frontier. It's not at the frontier, but it could be, especially when it comes to drilling. You need to drill. You need to be able to drill deep, 10 kilometers ideally. So at 8 kilometers, you can get a lot of heat in some part, depending on where you are. If you can get the 10 or more, you can get heat anywhere on the planet. You can get it in the Gangetic Basin. You can get it across Africa. In other words, it would be a game changer for civilization. And you bring the heat to the surface and you use it to generate electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's all kinds of great things. It's baseload power. It's dispatchable. It's the best kind of power. It's climate resilient. In other words, and it's socially and economically resilient. With the nuclear power plants in Ukraine, we realized, oh, geez, you have social disintegration in a war, and it gets kind of scary having a nuclear power plant in the middle of this.
Yeah.
With a geothermal plant, it would just shut down. The pumps would stop operating. And when things are more stable, you fire the pumps up again and start generating power, right? It's what we need.
So how close are we to being able to drill?
Okay, so the last key thing is that compared to wind and solar, it's got very high power density. So in other words, the number of watts you're generating per square meter on the surface of the planet can be as high as a nuclear power plant. Okay.
Wow.
So the trick is drilling. Getting those costs for drilling down to about $5 million a well to go 10 kilometers. And that's that's an order of magnitude improvement in drilling. But it's an engineering problem. And human beings have solved engineering problems as tough as this before. There's no question. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe $1 trillion all told on fusion, and it's always 50 years in the future. If we'd spent a tenth of that on geothermal, we'd be powering half the planet with it right now. It's so anyway, that's for me, that's hope. When people say, okay, what do you mean? If we can solve the energy problem and reduce the amount of the surface of the planet that we're using for energy generation, as well as reduce the carbon in the atmosphere, we can return vast areas of the surface of the planet to nature in bioregional governance. So there's the larger story, right?
And we've got a few bioregional experts on this call, just so you know. So you might get bombarded with emails, but remember that the patterns and principles. Are you frozen or am I?
I see you frozen, but I don't know whether that's you or me. I
But you can
think
hear me.
I
There
can,
we
you can
go.
hear.
I think
Now
we're
you
back.
go. There you go. Yeah.
Um, the bioregional, the language I use is honor, community, and place, which is a way to say that life and human culture exist in place. So that's got to be fundamental. But it is only one of multiple patterns and principles. So it's not a silver bullet. So we need to talk about
Yeah, we
the
will.
other ones.
And I don't know if you would consider place in sort of a Burkean sense as human communities grounded in their history and their,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
The
yeah,
essence of place, to quote the Regenesis group, just
yeah,
as people have an essence.
yeah. So that we do need to talk
It's
that.
the trans-contextual culture geological reality of place.
And this is thinking now after catagenesis and whatever transformation we're going through, that new basin of attraction out around 2150 or something like that on a planet that is significantly hotter and that unfortunately will be significantly biodegraded because of the
Yeah,
collapse of ecosystems. And then, but so part of this has to be a collaborative, co-evolutionary process with nature to rebuild nature in new forms on the planet using our technical
yeah,
expertise and science.
yeah,
I think that could be a hero project for the species. It could be very
yeah,
exciting.
yeah. And it kind of, getting back to the name of your institute, the cascade can be a positive or a negative. And so our
Exactly.
job
Make
is
it
to
possible.
create the conditions for positive cascade.